Who's who in the early church. Steve left off in the last show with some of our early church Christian father writers. And Steve, I'd like you now to pick up where we left off from show number 1,
okay,
on the who's who, you might say, of a roadmap leading through our early church fathers, and just take it from there and show us the way, brother.
Okay. In the early church, there were certain people who excelled at being called apologists. And the first apologists, when the Christians were being persecuted, they were people like Athenagorus in 177 AD, and Quadratus and Aristides, whom we don't have as much on. But they would write letters to the emperor, and these would be like public letters. And they would say why Christianity is reasonable, why Christians shouldn't be persecuted. After all, if they accepted some of the Greek philosophers, some of whom were atheists, they should accept Christians who believe in one God. And then they also showed why the paganism of Roman and Greek and Egyptian was foolish and silly. Now maybe that didn't score them any points with pagan emperors, but that's what they did. And they had some very good arguments that were kind of refined later by later writers. Another early church father was Theophilus, Bishop of Antioch. Now Theophilus, he wrote, as you can see, he wrote about 166 and he died either 181 AD or 188 AD. We're not sure. He was the first person that we have on record to use the word Trinity. And the way he uses it is kind of in an offhand way, like he already presumed that his readers were already familiar with the term. So it had been probably used prior to that. It's just they weren't, we don't have the written records of it. And but ever since Ignatius and the earliest fathers, who we call Jesus is God and everything, it's like there was no debate about the basic concepts behind the Trinity, but the word itself, this is the first use of that. Irenaeus of Lyon, which is actually kind of an outpost of Christianity, you might say, in France. He was an extremely influential writer who was quoted by many early ones, and what he set out to do was to write a listing of every single cult and other religion of his time. And it was quite extensive, showing all the different groups and what was wrong with them and why Christianity was reasonable. And so his basic work is called Irenaeus Against Heresies.
So you're basically saying Irenaeus was sort of like a first century Walter Martin,
yes,
with his Kingdom of the Cults,
right,
famous in the 20th century.
Right, and for that time, written on the manuscripts, Irenaeus' work was pretty massive also. And he taught, and some of the groups we only know from what he wrote. And also Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who, if you remember, was a disciple of John the Apostle. And Irenaeus had a disciple named Hippolytus. And Hippolytus wrote a refutation of all heresies too, kind of like an updated version of what Irenaeus did. And he wrote about a few other groups, such as the Nicene, for example, and they're the ones who had the book The Gospel of Thomas, which some Jesus Seminar people today really like. And they were Hippolytus was aware of them, Irenaeus was not, and so we conjecture that they probably started around that time and were not any earlier than that.
Now that's interesting that you mention all that, because we're both Christian apologists.
Then another problem, which we'll get in a little bit later, is people inside the church with some schisms. And a schism is like both sides are Christians, but they have a disagreement where they divide and separate. We'll talk about some of the maybe a little bit uglier things with that. But anyway, the next very influential church writer that we're going to just briefly highlight is Clement of Alexandria. And he wrote about 193 to either 217 to 220 AD. He also used the word Trinity. He also wrote a hymn about Christ, praising him as God. Now, he tried to co-opt the term Gnostic. Gnostic means like one in the know. And as we know from our previous program, the Gnostics claimed that salvation was through the secret special knowledge, and they had this knowledge. And Clement would say, no, we are the true Gnostics because we're the ones who have the knowledge, not them. So he uses the word Gnostic, but he uses it in a totally different sense to say that the Gnostics are wrong and that we are the Gnostics. Beginning with Clement of Alexandria, you start to see just a little bit of maybe focus on the church versus maybe a little bit less focus on the Bible and a little bit on the tradition. Some people would find he was maybe a little legalistic with some of his stuff. If with Clement and later with Tertullian, they were against wearing women wearing any jewelry at all, and some of their other idiosyncrasies, but they really aren't found in the Bible. So things were just kind of starting to go maybe a tiny bit bad here, though, I think Clement was a believer and they, had good guys. Now, the next guy is a very interesting guy named Tertullian. He was a lawyer, worked as a lawyer before he became a Christian, and perhaps while he was a Christian too. And reading his stuff, you just kind of get the sense that here is a really brilliant guy using his mind for Christ. He is kind of the one most people think of. In fact, one book I read erroneously said that he was the first one to use the word Trinity.
Previously mentioned was Clement of Rome and his belief in the phoenix bird. And what the presenter fails to communicate to the viewers is that all the Ante-Nicene, all the Apostolic Fathers promoted the idea of the phoenix bird, which the Bible calls a myth and a fable. Ignatius is mentioned also, but the presenters fail to promote or to show the viewers that Ignatius was the one that brought in all these extra traditions that were not in the Bible. He taught such things as the Eucharist, and that Mary never lost her virginity, and so forth. This man was responsible for Catholic doctrine. Athenagorus was one of the men, like all of the Apostolic and Ante-Nicene Fathers, who promoted the ideas of a first century Jewish Greek philosopher. And Athenagorus promoted the ideal form and the reason of God and the energizing power from everything material. Theophilus of Antioch, it is true, was the first to coin the word Trinity. But what the presenters do not tell us about Theophilus is that he also promoted the ideas of the first century Jewish Greek philosopher. And the Trinity that he's promoting is the same Trinity that was coming. The 3 days before the luminaries that Theophilus mentions is also found in Philo. Philo of Judaeus, or Philo of Alexandria, was a first century Jewish Greek philosopher, and it is from this man that all the Apostolic and Ante-Nicene Fathers take their ideas of the Trinity. Philo was not a Christian, nor was he a Jewish Orthodox believer. He was a mystic. Irenaeus continues with the ideas of Theophilus and promotes the God, Word, and Wisdom Trinity as being the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He also promotes that all churches should line up and follow after the Church of Rome. That is why he is known as the father of Catholic tradition. Clement of Alexandria is known by many scholars in a grouping with Philo, Clement, and Origen. Why? Because he was a philosopher at heart, and he taught all the ideas of Philo and promoted the Logos of Philo, the Greek Logos. This is the truth of Clement of Alexandria, and he was known also by himself as a Gnostic. The presenters fail to tell us that Hippolytus of Rome was the first anti-pope in history. He brought a division to the Catholic Church. Why? Because the popes of his time did not endorse the ideas of a Trinity. And so he left the Catholic Church and formed his own. He also taught a nude baptism in the 2nd and 3rd century. Tertullian is known as one of the greatest theologians of his time. But what the presenters fail to tell the viewers is that Tertullian was also a believer in the phoenix bird, and he promoted it. He also took up from all the writings of his previous fathers, and he continued with the teaching of the Trinity. He left the Catholic Church for the Montanists. This video by Christian Answers is a good example of how Trinitarians treat the subject of the Apostolic and Ante-Nicene Fathers. There is so much information that is not being said. There's so much information that is kept in the dark. And most people do not know, not even 1/3 of what the Apostolic Fathers taught. And it's a big mission to fulfill, because it's not easy to study the Ante-Nicene Fathers. But my 5-year research has uncovered so many things. But the number one thing that I want to tell you all is that all of the Apostolic and Ante-Nicene Fathers took their ideas from Philo of Alexandria. They promoted the Greek logos of Philo of Alexandria as being the Son of God, and so many other things. The 3 days before the luminaries, which Theophilus taught as a Trinity, was taken directly from Philo of Alexandria. And Irenaeus took up from Theophilus and from Philo of Alexandria in teaching that God was God, Word, and Wisdom. And Irenaeus, along with Theophilus, explains that it is God, and His Word is the Son, and wisdom is the Holy Spirit. This is how they started the Trinity doctrine, from the teachings of Philo of Alexandria. And they started developing the Trinity from there, and it kept going and going until it became state law. But this is the truth of the Apostolic and Ante-Nicene Fathers. And again, there's so much that we need to cover, so much things that are being left out by many people who claim to be teaching on the early church fathers. I would like to tell you that it is my hope and my prayer that these theologians will be honest and tell you everything about the Ante-Nicene Fathers. I pray that you will have the ability to study and research on these things and find out that the Trinity doctrine was pagan from the very beginning.